Barry, I spoke to you on Near FM only last week talking about your reaction to the budget announced earlier that week, and you told me in that interview that you expected the new gambling regulator in the Republic of Ireland to be in place for 2022. Since we did our last interview, I've read a couple of newspaper articles on the latest news with the regulator and legislation in general to control the gambling industry in Ireland. Could you tell our listeners as to what the latest news is, Barry, since we spoke last week?
Yeah, it appears that the Minister of State, James Brown, who's responsible for the gambling regulation, is stating that he wouldn't expect a gambling regulator to be in place until 2023. Now, the original Gambling Control Bill was published by Alan Shatter in 2013. So if that's the case, that'll be 10 years to get from publishing a piece of legislation to actually seeing a regulator in place, which from our perspective is completely unacceptable. I mean, the longest running piece of legislation in the history of the Irish state up to this point was the Public Health Alcohol Act that took 3 years to enact, and of course there was a lot of lobbying from various industries around that, and naturally it took a long time. But that was 3 years. That's the record so far. We've already doubled that at this stage, over 7 years to this point, and they're talking about an additional 3 years. It's completely unacceptable for the people that we're working with on a daily basis, who are being preyed upon by the gambling industry in the absence of any regulation.
And I know you're also, as part of your job, a addiction counsellor, aren't you?
That's right, yeah.
And like on a personal level, as regards the clients you deal with, like how much of an impact how does it affect your work on a day-to-day level, like this postponement of the target, like?
Well, there's a few things. I mean, let's say this week alone, I've had calls from at least just this week, 2 people off the top of my head who have phoned up prominent online gambling operators to say that they wanted to close their accounts and do a thing called self-excluding, which is a thing that basically you bar yourself from reopening an account. So not only are you closing the account, but your email address, your bank account details, your credit or debit card details are put on a database, and you can't open an account with that gambling operator again for, say, a year or 5 years, or for life in some cases. And what we get is people ringing up to do that. They ring up the customer service agents at big name gambling companies who would be well known. And instead of being told, yeah, that's no problem, you have a gambling problem, we'll close down your account and we'll bar you for whatever period of time you want to be barred for, instead of that, they're being offered free bets, money, or to be put on their accounts to stay with that gambling provider and keep the account open. Now, that is completely unacceptable behaviour, and it's the sort of race to the bottom that you get when there's no regulator in place. In the UK, if a gambling operator was doing that, they would get massive fines from the gambling regulator. So, from the perspective of somebody who's trying to stop gambling, they've identified that they have a gambling problem. It's completely unacceptable behaviour from gambling operators, bookmakers, online casinos to be doing that stuff. It's reminiscent of the sort of stuff that was going on in inner city Dublin in the 1980s with drug dealers dropping bags of heroin in people's letterboxes. Like there's parallels there with the sort of stuff that some gambling operators engage in when there's no regulator there to stop them. And that makes it much harder for people who want to stop and who really need to stop to actually do that.
And a lot of the clients you're dealing with, must be dealing with a lot of tragic stories. I imagine it's kind of heartbreaking for you to deal with your clients every day, knowing that the latest target has been postponed again, is it?
Yeah, it's extremely frustrating because we're dealing with people day in, day out, whether it's people who are in addiction who want to try and stop, or family members who are crawling the walls trying to get the person, their loved one, to stop gambling or to admit that there's a problem, or they've just found out that there's some massive debt that a person has incurred as a result of their gambling. So the harm that's caused that we see day in, day out at a human level is absolutely massive. And what's tied in with this proposed legislation and regulation is government funding that would be ring-fenced for services, residential treatment, community-based treatment, harm prevention and research and education around problem gambling that just keeps on getting kicked down the road. And every time you talk to a politician about trying to get funding for these types of services, they say, oh, when the regulation comes in, there'll be funding there. Now, that's been going on for 7 years. So for 7 years, they've been kicking that can down the road. No government funding has ever been made available for any form of problem gambling treatment or prevention services. And now we're talking about another 3 years of that on top of there being no regulation.
And am I right in saying that problem gambling in Ireland, or addiction to gambling, is not actually recognised as a public health issue?
Not yet. It's not in the HSE's service plan. I know the Institute for Public Health in Ireland certainly would see it as a public health issue, but we haven't seen it, say, from the Department of Health or from the HSE. And that's worrying, because if you look at the government's own figures, say on the prevalence, so the percentage of the population that the government says has a gambling problem is 0.8% of the population. It'd be in the region of 30,000 people. Now, the government also says that the percentage of people in Ireland who are dependent on opiates, so it'd be heroin and other opiates, is 0.7% of the population, right? So they're in the same ballpark, same sort of numbers. And obviously, rightly, a substantial amount of money and resources are put into helping people who are opiate dependent. And we'd like to see some resources being put into a similar amount of people who are severely addicted to gambling and whose lives are being destroyed by gambling and whose loved ones' lives are being destroyed by the gambling addiction.
Yeah, the article by Ali Bracken in last Sunday Independent was, I think, fairly comprehensive coverage of the latest news. In that article, Minister St. James Browne is reported to have said that he expects legislation to have gone through the Oireachtas next year, which will mean that there will be legislation, I think, or a lot of the legislation probably enacted maybe by 2022. Are there any other elements of the legislation, Barry, that will or could make a big impact, say, in 2022 if that legislation goes through?
Well, something that Minister Browne mentioned in that article was a ban on credit card gambling, which wasn't in the original gambling control bill. So that would be something definitely we would welcome. I mean, they've done it in the UK recently. I mean, allowing people to gamble with borrowed money is an absolute disaster. And that's how many of the people that we work with get into severe difficulty, and they're taking out lots of different credit cards and maxing them out while they're chasing their losses. So that will be a big one. Looking at curbs on advertising as well. So at the moment, some of the radio stations will be playing gambling ads from morning through to night. Yeah, similarly with TV, social media, which is much harder to control, is just wall to wall with gambling ads 24 hours a day. So there will be talk of some restrictions, maybe a watershed being put on gambling advertising, which we will welcome as well, because at the moment it's being completely normalised to children in a way that other over 18s products like cigarettes or alcohol are not. Rightly, there's a watershed on other over 18s products.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but like I had to be on social media a good bit, and anytime I'm on Twitter or whatever, and an ad for either an alcohol company or a gambling company comes up, I just put them on block, because it just makes me sick, Okay, okay, Barry, it's come towards the end of the interview. I only spoke to you on Near FM last Friday, as we said at the start of the interview. Is there anything else you want to tell our listeners about before you go about the upcoming time?
Well, look, I mean, if there's anybody who's concerned about this or thinks, like us, that this has taken way, way too long, contact your local TV and just let them know that you're unhappy about this situation, because we know from dealing with people on the ground on a daily basis that this is a massive issue. It's much more hidden than other forms of addiction, say drug addiction or alcohol addiction, but it's there and it's rampant and it's causing massive problems. And if the government doesn't get a handle on it, there's a good chance that we're going to lose a generation to severe gambling addiction in this country. So if you're listening and if you're passionate about this, or if you care about this in any way, contact your local TV and let them know that you want to see something done about this.